Well, first, I want to make it absolutely clear that we have 5 Eagle Rings, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. I had a question on that in the hall. And if you look at the numbers, if you're in the Marines or the Coast Guard, you have a much better chance of winning a ring. So update your profile. About a month ago, the Washington Post, the newspaper of record for Washington, D.C., and the political trade journal for the United States of America, had a full-page story on the most powerful woman in the defense establishment. And she is our next speaker and guest today. I'd like to introduce the Honorable Michele Flournoy, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She has a bachelor's degree from Harvard and a master's in international relations from Oxford. Great schools, but our last 2 speakers were PhDs from Princeton. What's next? Her previous positions have included President of the Center for New American Security, one of the most important of the nonpartisan think tanks in Washington, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Threat Reduction, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. We were just chatting, and Secretary Flournoy's tenure of service in this undersecretary position will end on Friday. We hope that that doesn't diminish your ability to speak forthrightly, boldly, and with some controversy, and invite all the questions that we can off the floor. Again, if you have questions, start writing them as soon as it pops in your mind. Pass it to the center, and we will continue the Q&A after the Secretary's prepared remarks. Secretary Flournoy.
Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. The most important qualification, though, for me to speak to this crowd that was forgotten, and that is I'm the wife of a Navy reservist. So, but it's really an honor to be here with all of you today. And what makes this particularly meaningful for me, as was noted, this is my last public speech in office as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And I really can't think of an audience that I would rather sign off with than this one. The ROA is a really remarkable organization, not only a professional organization of some 60,000 members from all of the uniformed services, and an advocate for the 1.5 million Americans who are now serving in the reserve components, but also an educational body that seeks to foster better public understanding of national security issues. As many of you no doubt know, the ROA's corporate charter was signed into law in 1950 by President Harry Truman. There's something very fitting about the fact that an organization dedicated to promoting public awareness of national security issues would be so recognized at that particular moment in time by that particular president. After all, it was a moment of profound transition in the world and in our own defense establishment. The Second World War had ended only 5 years before, and a new Cold War with the Soviet Union was just beginning in earnest. Moscow had just carried out its first successful atom bomb test in August of 1949. Another wartime ally, China, had just seen the end of a long civil war, and Mao's forces were now leading the world's most populous nation. On the neighboring Korean peninsula, the year 1950 would see an invasion of the South by the North, an event that quickly drew in the forces of the United States and our allies and partners around the world. In response to these and other changes in the security landscape, President Truman and a truly extraordinary group of senior advisors responded by embarking on a series of programs, reviews, initiatives that brought about fundamental changes to our national security and our foreign policy systems. Just think about it, the Marshall Plan, the establishment of the Department of Defense and an independent Air Force, the formation of the CIA, the development of multinational bodies like NATO, the United Nations, the development of NSC 68 and the containment policy towards the Soviet Union. This multidimensional response, drawing upon a range of American diplomatic, economic, cultural, and military resources, proved to be quite successful in containing the Soviet Union and setting the stage for ultimate victory in the Cold War. With that victory, some observers hopefully declared that history had come to an end and that we could look forward to an era, a lasting era, of relative global harmony. That obviously did not come to pass, as the attacks on 9/11 and other events made all too clear. In the years since, we have passed one signpost after another, marking the arrival of an even more complex strategic era. The swift growth of China's economy and the broad-based, though quite opaque, modernization of its armed forces. The emergence of asymmetric and hybrid forms of warfare, which pose new challenges for states and militaries. The arrival of cyberspace as a domain of potential conflict, one that forces us to revisit long-standing ideas of deterrence and culpability and the very definition of warfare itself. The potential proliferation of the most dangerous technologies in the world, particularly to irresponsible regimes. North Korea has already tested nuclear weapons, and Iran continues to seek its own nuclear weapons capability in violation of its treaty obligations and established international norms. The emergence of broad geopolitical trends whose national security consequences are potentially enormous but still somewhat unclear, from the Arab awakening to global climate change. And as if all this weren't enough, in 2008 we suffered the most acute financial crisis since the Great Depression, shaking the very foundation of America's national security, our economic strength. This has required some painful adjustments, and as you know, the Budget Control Act passed by Congress requires that $487 billion be found in savings from the department's budget over the next decade. Several observers, both at home and abroad, have looked at all of these factors and concluded that we are embarking on an era of long-term U.S. decline, a steady erosion of American leadership in the world. I'm here to tell you that I strongly disagree with this thesis. While our challenges are undeniable, they are no greater, frankly, than those that previous generations of Americans have faced, including Harry Truman and his advisors early on in the Cold War. That generation of statesmen and officers met the challenges of their time by thinking strategically and seriously and practically about how to sustain U.S. leadership in a time of great change. And that's exactly what prompted this president, President Obama, and Secretaries Gates and Panetta to undertake a comprehensive review of our defense strategy and our force structure at this time. The title of the guidance that the department recently released, Sustaining U.S. Global Leadership, Principles for 21st Century, it was chosen very deliberately. The emphasis throughout the review, from President Obama to Secretary Panetta on down, has been that the size, structure, and capabilities of our military must be driven by strategy, not the other way around. To protect our country and maintain U.S. leadership, we need to set smart, sensible priorities for the future. At the outset of the review, Secretary Panetta laid out 4 main principles to guide us, which in turn also guided our budget, the budget plan, which was just rolled out last week. First, he said, we must maintain the world's finest military, one that supports and sustains the unique global leadership role of the United States. Second, we must avoid hollowing out the force. A smaller, ready, and well-equipped equipped military is preferable to a larger force without adequate investment in readiness or modernization. Third, savings must be achieved in a balanced manner. Everything has to be on the table, no sacred cows, including potentially sensitive areas that will likely provoke opposition in Congress, industry, and some advocacy groups. Fourth, we have to preserve the quality of the all-volunteer force and not break faith with the men and women who serve and with their families. I think the strategic guidance remains true to all four of those principles. The force of the future that it outlines will remain capable across the spectrum of missions. While it will be smaller of necessity, it will also be flexible, agile, and above all, ready. This force will be called upon to help meet a very broad range of challenges and objectives. The new guidance laid out a series of strategic elements, including the following: increasing our emphasis on the Asia-Pacific and sustaining our forces in the Middle East while keeping America's Article 5 commitments in Europe. The protection of investments in vital areas such as Special Operations Forces, ISR, Precision Strike, Counter-WMD, and cyberspace. Ensuring that the U.S. can still conduct combat operations and deal effectively with aggression in more than one theater at a time. Let me be very clear. It's not a question of whether we're able to confront more than one adversary at a time. It's a question of how. And our operational concepts are evolving and changing to meet the threats of the future. A shift away from ground forces sized for sustained, large-scale stability operations and towards somewhat smaller and more modernized ground forces equipped to respond to a wider range of threats. The protection of our ability to surge, regenerate, and mobilize to counter any threat around the world. And that is a degree of what we call reversibility, to ensure that our forces are not caught off guard by unforeseen or swiftly developing threats. This is critical given that we have to have a certain humility about our ability to predict the future. In the weeks since the President and Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Chiefs stood all together at the Pentagon to introduce the new strategic guidance, this document has generated a fair amount of speculation. This is Washington, after all. Are we adhering to the two-war force sizing construct, or are we abandoning it? As we commit to the Asia-Pacific, will other parts of the world be neglected? By shifting away from our sizing our ground forces for long, large-scale counterinsurgency and stability operations, are we turning our back on the hard-fought lessons of the last decade? And most important of all, by slowing the historic post-9/11 increases in military spending, as Congress required us to do, are we signaling somehow that we're entering a period of American global retrenchment and retreat from the world? As I mentioned earlier, the decision to title the new strategic guidance Sustaining U.S. Global Leadership was quite deliberate. We are retaining full capability to confront more than one aggressor anywhere in the world. Even if we are engaged in large-scale operations, we will be able to quickly deny the objectives of an opportunistic adversary and or impose unacceptable costs in another theater of the world. Even as we rebalance our posture towards Asia-Pacific and continue to place a premium on our presence in the Middle East, we will uphold our NATO commitments, including through new rotational deployments of additional ground and naval forces as announced by Secretary Panetta a few weeks ago. In other regions of the world, such as Latin America and Africa, we will continue to develop small footprint, innovative approaches that maintain our presence, invest in our relationships with partner nations at relatively low cost. The use of an austere base in Djibouti for the recent SOF rescue of 2 aid workers held in Somalia is just an example of how effective such presence can be. And even if we no longer size our Army and Marine Corps for large-scale multi-year stability operations such as those in Afghanistan and Iraq, we are establishing ways to retain the key expertise and the lessons learned so that a subsequent generation of Americans does not have to painfully relearn them as we did after Vietnam. The underlying theme that runs through all of this is an emphasis on flexibility, agility, readiness, on retaining capability across the full spectrum of missions. This is the key to sustaining our leadership in an era of complex challenges and hard fiscal choices. Consider, for example, one of the most discussed words in the strategic guidance, and I mentioned it before, reversibility. Some have seized on this word as a sign that somehow our principles are not firmly fixed, or that our decisions on key programs are subject to rapid change. In fact, reversibility means something completely different. It refers to our ability to make course corrections in response to strategic, economic, or technological change. For example, even as we reduce the overall size of our ground forces, we will keep a relatively high proportion of mid-grade officers who would be at a particular premium if we needed to build up those forces quickly. In this context, the Guard and the Reserve will play an extremely important role. It is your expertise, your dedication, your commitment, and your readiness that will enable our military to have the built-in adaptability and resourcefulness I have just described. We expect the reserve components to continue to provide both an operational and a strategic reserve in the future. They will continue to be a source of innovative approaches to building the capacity of critical partners around the world. And here I want to take a moment to highlight the State Partnership Program, which pairs National Guard units of a given state with a particular partner country. One of the first such partnership relationships was established back in 1993 between the Illinois National Guard and the Polish military. Since then, Illinois Guardsmen and Polish forces have deployed together to both Iraq and Afghanistan, and the troops from the land of Lincoln have helped the Poles with such matters as developing a stronger NCO corps along the American model. As for the reserves, we've already begun to see a further expansion of missions and responsibilities to help the nation meet urgent national security needs. In the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 12, for example, there are provisions allowing service secretaries to call up to 60,000 reservists into active duty for as long as a year outside of times of war and emergency. This allows greater access to reserve components for pre-planned missions for the combatant commanders. In addition, the NDAA also allows the Secretary of Defense to activate reservists up to 120 days upon request from a state governor for disaster or emergency situations. Before this, as many of you know, this wasn't possible. This deprived us all of greater access to the great expertise that reservists can bring to bear in emergency situations. These provisions reflect an awareness on the part of leaders in the administration and on the Hill of just how important the reserve can be to our security across the range of potential situations. While the Guard and Reserve will be essential components of our future force, there remain many questions about your future role. For example, how should reserve component units returning from combat be reset? How should we reset their equipment and training in light of the new strategy, recognizing that we can't afford to place equal emphasis on all scenarios and mission sets? What types of skill sets and units should be considered as candidates for the operational reserve that we would expect to be activated and deployed more frequently than normally is the case? What types of units, if any, can be held at lower levels of readiness and mobilized only in time of larger scale protracted conflict? And how can we as a department and as a community, as a nation, do a better job of ensuring that our Guard and Reserve members are not unfairly penalized, by current or potential employers in what is already a very difficult economy. The Obama administration is extremely serious about expanding career opportunities for veterans, and we've launched a series of initiatives to help out. But there's certainly much more to be done in this arena. I'd like to conclude my remarks on a note of optimism. One of the reasons I so strongly believe that we will indeed see a period of sustained American leadership is that when circumstances are difficult, we as a country, as a people, do find a way to come together for the broader national interest. We've seen a very practical illustration of this in the recent strategic review. Times of fiscal hardship often beget, as you know, very intense inter-service rivalries and contention. While there were certainly honest disagreements in the review process, I think the people involved, civilian and military alike, found the process to be remarkably collegial, and the strategic trumped the parochial time and time again. If anything, the Secretary's commitment to open communication, to shared buy-in, only intensified as the process went forward. This was a remarkable thing to witness, and I've seen many reviews in the Pentagon before. And it gives me a lot of faith, frankly, in our civilian and military leadership to make sound decisions as these very difficult choices have to be made in the months and years ahead. No doubt, those choices will involve some sacrifice. For example, as part of the total force, the reserve components will experience some end strength reductions commensurate with their active duty counterparts. In addition, the department has to seek greater efficiencies in our basing infrastructure, rationalizing it to meet the needs of a smaller and more flexible force, and to ensure that we have the resources to invest in readiness and modernization. Critical initiatives like this will require us to look beyond our narrow interests, the narrow interests of any particular office or department, state, region, party, or branch of the armed forces. There are those who would believe that we've lost the ability to do this. The process that generated the strategic guidance, though, gives me hope to think otherwise. I think we are better than our skeptics would argue. The truth is, we must transcend the partisan and the parochial. Our national security depends on it in a time of austerity. So as I step down from my current position, I feel a great sense of honor to have worked with so many outstanding men and women, military and civilian. And many of them I see in this room today. And again, I thank you for your service to this country, and I wish you all the best. God bless, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
In retrospect, as you leave office this week, what, looking back on when you took office, was your greatest surprise?
You know, I think...
Pleasant or otherwise.
There are many surprises, but I think, you know, right before I came into this office, I had actually written a report called The Inheritance, which was really documenting how daunting the set of challenges that the new president, at the time we didn't know who it was going to be, how daunting the inheritance of challenges was going to be for this American president. And I think what surprised me is how much more challenging things got. I mean, at the time we wrote that report, we documented the fiscal crisis, rise of new powers, proliferation of WMD, new domains like cyberspace and space and so forth. But we didn't anticipate the Arab Spring. We didn't anticipate some of the other developments that have happened. And so I think what's been the biggest surprise is that just when we thought we had it bad, it got even worse. But truly, what's remarkable has been how this current civil-military team has really pulled together to grapple with these changes and to try to do it in a very integrated way that more often than not takes a whole-of-government approach.
Could you comment, for those of us who really don't have the experience in it, how is policy developed in the Department of Defense and then beyond the Department of Defense?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, I'd say policy initiatives may come from within the Department of Defense, but if they are significant for our national security, they almost always get brought into a broader interagency discussion and process. And so I think it works a couple of ways. There may be a bright idea that comes from the bottom up, perhaps from the field or perhaps from somewhere in the department. And typically, in my role, I will bring that into the deputies process so that you have the Deputy National Security Advisor, you have members of the intelligence community, State Department, USAID, Treasury, the whole, sometimes Homeland Defense or Homeland Security if that's appropriate. And we massage the initiative and develop options for the principal and ultimately the president to consider. Other times you'll have a top-down initiative where the president sees an opportunity, wants to go in a particular direction, and that process will be harnessed from the top down. But the good news is that there's ample opportunity, and I think there's always to sort of to lead from wherever you sit by putting good intellectual capital, well-thought-out ideas on the table.
Some have suggested that it's not as nimble as it might be, and that when policy is formed at the department level, beyond the department, and in the interagency, it becomes broken. Can you comment on that?
You know, I spent a lot of my time in between stints in government writing about how the interagency process needs to be improved, because when you think about the challenges we face, it's hard to think of one where only one instrument of national power gets you to a solution. It almost always involves the combined efforts of multiple different agencies and perspectives and resource streams. And so it's very important that we have a process that integrates. We all love to complain about this process, but I will tell you that I think because of these tremendous challenges we face, because we're in a country still at war where you have to be responsive, I think we've developed a process that really tries to be responsive to need. It's not always successful, but I think it's more successful now than I've ever seen it before. That means that I spend a lot of my time with my colleagues from other departments, working together several hours per day, trying to hammer out interagency solutions to some of the challenges we face.
You touched on changing roles for the reserve component, and included in those would be variable readiness for mobilization for different missions. So if I'm interpreting this correct, we are looking for expanded use of the reserve force. We come out of a period where the reservists, Director Petraeus had folks raise their hand, and we have people in the audience who've been mobilized 3 times in the last 10 years. Unprecedented service. At the same time, there is discussion. You said that everything's on the table. What is the current policy thinking about the incentives for service, particularly reserve service, health care, retirement benefits, et cetera?
Well, first of all, let me clarify. I think if you look at the height of the demand for reserve utilization, which is when we were at the peak in both Iraq and now Afghanistan, I think that if you take that as the peak, the demand is going to come down gradually. We have completed the mission in Iraq. We are still working very hard in Afghanistan, and we are making progress towards our 2014 transition goals. But you can expect that gradually over time, over the coming years, that commitment is going to come down. So overall, I think demand's going to be coming down. The question is, we have organized the reserve components in the Guard to be a fully operational reserve in the last several years to support that very high demand. As that demand comes down, the question of whether we keep that uniform level of readiness across the entire force, or whether we look at different possibilities within the Guard and Reserve, where some who on a volunteer basis want to deploy more often raise their hands and volunteer to do so and have a higher tempo, if you will. Others who really want to reset to more of a strategic reserve, and so forth. So the truth is, those are questions that we need to work through with you in the coming years to figure out what is that model that is going to be responsive to the needs of the future. What does that look like? I think going forward, in terms of pay and compensation, we are taking a total force look at this. Let me be clear, no one is planning any pay cuts. I think the Secretary, the Chairman, were very clear on this. What we are looking at is a gradual slowing of the growth of increase in compensation. I think you've seen since 2011 2001, I'm sorry, something like a 40% increase in military compensation, just getting my figures right, even though the number of personnel only increased by 8%. We absolutely want to protect funding for wounded warriors, for family programs, for transitioning veterans, and you will see us continuing to invest in those areas. But we have to look at areas like compensation, like health care, where we still have some fairly perverse incentives in place. Many of you may know that even if you're a working age retiree and you have access to TRICARE as a reservist or a guardsman or what have you, or even as a retired active duty person, you may still be able to, and even if you have the ability to get health care with your employer, your private sector employer, you can still stay on TRICARE and not take the private sector coverage. That means the Department of Defense is carrying a lot of health care costs that would otherwise be borne by private sector employers. And while in principle, you could make an argument for that, the truth is in reality, what happens is that that is money that's not being spent on capabilities, on equipment, on training, on readiness, on other kinds of programs for our personnel. And so we really need to look at this as in a holistic way. Similarly on retirement. No one is going to change the contract on someone who's already serving, but we have asked Congress for an authority, for a commission to sit down and look at this holistically, to ask the question of whether we can have a better system. The majority of our military members don't stay on 20 years. Most of them spend many, many years in the military and walk away with nothing in terms of retirement. Is that the right model for us going forward? So I think these are the kinds of questions. There are no easy answers. They're very, very politically charged, difficult issues. But we owe it to ourselves and to the country to sit down and try to wrestle with these to come up with a better approach.
We in the reserves already enjoy the gray area between our retirement and 60 years old. Mm-hmm. Is a similar period being contemplated for the active component?
Again, we are looking forward to the establishment of this commission, and I don't have any particular proposals that have been put on the table as yet.
I was chatting with the junior officers this morning, remembering back on my reserve service in the 1970s after coming back from Southeast Asia. And there was a period where we were running through the woods yelling bang, bang, because there was no training ammunition. The funds have been cut out of the Carter year defense budgets. And it took 15 years to recover the capability of the reserve force for Desert Storm that evolved into the current operational use of the reserve. What's being thought of as there's a defense drawdown to guarantee that we don't have, as more missions go to the reserve and the Guard, what's being contemplated to ensure that we have the resources, training, and equipment to do those missions?
It's a great question, and we do not want to go back to the days that you described. I think that was the reason the Secretary, in his guidance up front, emphasized that second injunction, that we don't want to go to a hollow force. We don't want to keep more force structure than we can afford to modernize and make ready. And I think when you look at it, take a total force perspective, that certainly goes to the Guard and Reserve, particularly when we are relying on you all to be part of this notion of reversibility, being agile and being able to adapt to unforeseen contingencies or circumstances in the future. So one of the things we're doing management-wise is paying particular attention to how the services are resourcing readiness, both active component and reserve and Guard, going forward, and we will continue to do that.
I heard a discussion yesterday in an Army senior leaders seminar here that suggested that in some units that vehicles are not being taken out of the motor pool because of shrunken dollars for fuel. Down on that grassroots level, will these policy shifts ensure that that doesn't happen?
Well, again, I think that the monitoring that, tracking it, I think making sure that kind of example gets to senior leader attention. I can tell you the intention is at the top is to ensure that we hold people accountable for keeping the force ready. And I know that that's certainly the Secretary's intention, and he and the Chairman are working very hard towards that end.
There has been a recent thrall with the use of special operation forces. Typically a mission that has never gone to the reserve. I commanded a Marine Reserve battalion in Desert Storm that became special operations capable, and as soon as we got home, that was off the table. Is there any thought in the restructuring of the forces to migrate special operations capability to the reserve?
There actually are, in the Army, there are special operations reserve units, SF in particular, that do maintain certain linguistic focus, regional focus, and very much play in the partner capacity building mission and that sort of thing. So, you know, what I don't know is whether SOCOM plans to expand that over time. But again, I think, you know, given when you think of the cultural richness of this country and the linguistic richness of this country, it's a particularly good way to tap into that in many ways. But I'm not sure on the particular plans of whether that element will expand.
This new strategy guidance, how will it influence the 2014 quadrennial defense review process? Is this going to be a full-up QDR, or is this a chance to make course corrections with potentially a new administration or a new shift in this administration's priorities?
I think, you know, what the next QDR, the quadrennial defense review, looks like will depend on a couple things. First, whether or not we're in an era of sequestration, God forbid, or whether Congress does its job and makes the necessary hard choices to avoid going down that path. If we are in a more sustainable budgetary trajectory, then obviously the changes, the fiscal environment, the change in the fiscal environment will be less dramatic, and frankly much better for our national security. In terms of the other key factor is who wins the election. If President Obama is reelected, typically the QDRs of second-term presidents are obviously less dramatic than the first term because they are adjusting off their own baseline. If someone new comes into office, typically they do a more fulsome QDR that really goes back soup to nuts, reviews everything, and makes more, makes changes based on that. So it really depends on some circumstances we can't foresee at this point. What our job is in OSD, but particularly in the military and the Joint Staff, is to really prepare for either case and to ensure that we've done some of the intellectual work to tee up options for a future president, whoever that may be.
You use the word reversibility. How would that apply to the industrial support base for defense, which has been pinched in the recent year and foresees an even greater constriction of resources for support of defense acquisition and R&D? For
the industrial base, it means a couple things. One is a an effort to protect our investment in science and technology and research and development as much as we can, even under a tightening fiscal situation, because that is the seed corn of our future. It also means that in some particular areas where if you lost a particular part of the industrial base, it would take you years and years and years to recapture it, if ever. That fact has been factored into some of our program and budget decisions. So even though a particular program may have been weak or something we thought about doing away with, if in doing away with that we would completely lose a capability or the ability to have that capability in the future on a timely or responsive basis, that influenced the decision of what to do in that case. So it's a complex calculus, but we are quite serious about this notion of reversibility because of this experience we've had that I talked about at the beginning, that it's very hard to predict the future in this current environment, and it's too important to keep this institution's ability to be responsive to the unforeseen.
Okay. The Secretary has an appointment at a White House on 16th
Another Deputies Committee meeting on
Pennsylvania Avenue.
Interagency coherence on a topic.
This last question is going to be a bit of an omnibus question. I have several cards that have inquired about what our position policy ought to be towards Central and South America and Israel. Can you comment on the globe, and I would throw in Iran and Korea as well, spanning the globe, as they used to say in the wide world of sports.
See how many of those I can cover.
Where are we going?
Okay. I'm just trying to write all the ones you mentioned. Okay. Central and South America, very interesting. This is a region where we have some very strong partners, where we have common ideals and objectives with a number of the countries who, in an earlier era, emerged as democracies, sought to embrace free market economics and so forth. And so our military engagement is a very important part of a sort of whole of government engagement strategy. One of the things that we've seen, is that we have a real focus on building partner capacity. Take a case like Colombia, where Colombia, several years ago, 10 years ago, was really under siege with a very virulent insurgency. We invested, again, not just Department of Defense, but whole of government and Plan Colombia, to help them fight off that insurgency and build their capacity to secure Colombia, take care of themselves. What's happened through that experience is that Colombia has become a net exporter of security in the region. They are now training our friends in Mexico on flying helicopters. They are now training militaries in Central America on how to deal with counter-narcotics missions and so forth. And so, they've really given a lot of reality and some great example to this notion of building partner capacity and the value not only for us, but for security and stability in key regions where we may not have the forces available to do it all by ourselves all the time, particularly in the last decade when we were so occupied in South Asia and the Middle East. With regard to Israel, we remain a staunch ally of the State of Israel. We have a vital national interest in ensuring their security and their existence long term. We have an extremely close relationship and dialogue with them. That dialogue is very comprehensive. It is very candid. So we talk frankly about the peace process. We talk frankly about the dimensions, the security dimensions of the region, the trends and events, and so forth. And there's a lot that we agree on, and where we disagree, we have very frank dialogue with them. But the U.S. commitment to Israel has been something that has been sustained across many administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, since the country's founding, and that is no different today. Sorry, I'm running out of your North Korea was the next one?
Korea, keep at it. Iran.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, with regard to North Korea, our principal concern has been the potential for, has been the proliferation of nuclear weapons to that country and the potential that they could spread the technology to others, whether they be rogue states or terrorist organizations. We have sought working with others, China, Russia, South Korea, and so forth, to engage the North Koreans in six-party talks to try to get them back into compliance with their treaty obligations, to denuclearize and so forth. But in the absence of progress there, we have, with UN sanction, imposed, along with the international community, some pretty severe sanctions on many of their activities. We've just witnessed a leadership transition, or we are witnessing a transition underway with the passing of power from the father to the son. And it remains to be seen sort of how things will move forward. We have sought to let North Korea know that we want to see them come back to the negotiating table, that sanctions will remain in place until that happens, that we do not want to see any further provocations on the peninsula. Our commitment to stability on the peninsula, to our South Korean allies, is rock solid. You know, it really, the ball is in their court to see the fact that it's in their interests to enter into negotiations with the international community to try to resolve this situation.
Shall we conclude our world tour?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Before you go, first of all, we are beyond pleased that you chose the Reserve Officers Association to be the venue for what probably will be your final public address. And we thank you very much for the candid nature of your remarks and the insights that you've gained over the last 3 years. We have a couple tokens. First of all, something for your coffee table, our 90th anniversary coin.
I do collect these.
And a small but hopefully valued gift as you go forward. Let's give the Secretary a rousing applause.
Thank you very much.